Sandra used to count the days since her mother died. At first, she would scratch tallies into the cement wall behind the butcher's stall where she hid at night. But eventually, even numbers stopped meaning anything. Hunger had no calendar. Grief didn't care what day it was. At 16, her body was already giving up. Her bones jutted out of her dark skin, like branches after harmattan. Her hair, once thick and full, had thinned into brittle strands, coated with market dust and smoke. Her mother's voice, the one that used to sing lullabies in the dark, had faded into silence. The only sound now was the growl of her own empty stomach and the laughter of people walking past her like she was invisible. Sandra, sometimes Amanda, depending on who asked, had been homeless for weeks. She survived on what she could steal or beg, and on the few kind strangers who tossed her scraps wrapped in newspaper. She ate akara from gutters, bread that rats had bitten, drank water dripping from pipes behind the abattoir. When night came, she curled beneath market tables, holding a sack as blanket, praying the madmen or drunkards wouldn't find her. But some nights, they did. One had tried to touch her once. She bit him and ran. That's when she stopped sleeping deeply. But this particular day was different. It started with clouds that gathered without warning. By afternoon, the sky opened up and poured like God himself was angry. Sandra's small shelter, plastic sheets propped with wood, gave in within minutes. The storm didn't just soak her, it erased her. She tried to run, but slipped in the mud, her foot slamming against a stone. The pain shot through her leg like fire. She crawled toward the fence of a nearby shop, soaked, shivering, and starving. That was the last thing she remembered clearly. By the time her eyes fluttered open, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. She was lying in the mud, half-conscious, her lips cracked, her dress clinging to her like wet tissue. Her stomach felt like it was eating itself. That's when the car came. A black SUV, smooth and gleaming, like something out of a Nollywood dream, pulled to a gentle stop just a few feet from her. She squinted through the fogged air as the tinted window rolled down. A woman sat inside, dark-skinned, regal, with bold red lipstick and a jewel that shimmered under the streetlight. Her eyes scanned Sandra, not with pity, but with purpose. The door opened. Out stepped stilettos. Then perfume, sweet, strong, expensive, wrapped around Sandra's nose like smoke. The woman crouched beside her, not minding the mud. She held out a clean white handkerchief and gently wiped the side of Sandra's face. "You're hungry," she said softly, almost like a lullaby. "Come with me. I'll give you food, clothes, and 5 million nairas." Sandra's cracked lips parted, but no words came out. 5 million nairas? It sounded like madness. Money she'd never even seen in dreams. She wanted to ask what the catch was, but her body had no questions. Her hands were trembling. Her vision spun. Her stomach clenched so hard, she thought she'd vomit the air inside her. The woman, Madame Becky she later learned, reached out a hand, and Sandra, soaked, broken, and starving, took it. She didn't ask what difficult but rewarding meant. She couldn't. Not when her entire body screamed for food more than it screamed for answers. And so, she stepped into the car, not knowing that she wasn't stepping into comfort, but into a cage. One paved with gold and lined with teeth. Sandra had never imagined a house could look like this. Not even in those distant dreams she used to have when her mother was still alive. The mansion wasn't just beautiful. It was overwhelming. Everything inside glistened. From the marble floors polished to mirror-like perfection, to the chandeliers glittering high above her head. Perfume hung in the air, a sweet fragrance that seemed to whisper promises she desperately wanted to believe. When the doors had first opened, Sandra had stood there, frozen on the threshold, her mouth slightly open, eyes wide with disbelief. The past weeks of hunger and darkness made this place seem unreal, almost frightening in its luxury. She was gently ushered inside by Madame Becky, whose red-painted lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You like it?" Madame Becky asked softly, placing a delicate hand on Sandra's thin shoulder. Sandra could only nod, the words stuck somewhere deep in her throat. She was guided to a spacious room with a plush bed, the mattress so soft her fingers sunk into it when she touched the surface. Her body screamed in exhaustion, but she was too anxious to rest. They brought her food on a silver tray: rice, chicken, fruit, and Sandra's hunger took over completely. She ate quickly, forgetting all dignity. Real food. Warm food. Food that made her stomach feel heavy and satisfied for the first time in weeks. But even as she ate, a vague sense of dread began creeping around her thoughts. Why would anyone give this to her? A nobody, an orphan, a beggar? Soon, 2 gentle women appeared, and without speaking, took Sandra to a luxurious bathroom. They carefully removed her torn dress and bathed her like a child, scrubbing away weeks of grime and hopelessness. As warm water cascaded over her skin, Sandra briefly closed her eyes, imagining that maybe, just maybe, this moment could erase the years of hunger and pain. Afterward, they wrapped her in a soft white robe, combed out her tangled hair, and led her to another room, where a simple but elegant dress awaited her. As they helped her dress, one of the women leaned close, whispering softly, "Tonight is important. Just be clean and still. Don't ask questions, don't resist. Madame Becky will reward you greatly." Sandra wanted to ask what that meant, but fear clamped her lips shut tight. She felt like a puppet, whose strings were being pulled gently, but firmly into place. Her pulse quickened with every passing minute, an uneasy feeling building deep within her chest. When night finally came, Madame Becky herself appeared, her face calm yet coldly authoritative. Sandra was led through a series of hallways, past doors that were tightly shut, to one room at the end of the corridor. The heavy wooden door opened silently, revealing a dimly lit space. Sandra's heart leapt into her throat as she stepped inside. In the center of the room stood a foreign man, his expression cold, distant, and unreadable. At his side, on a leather leash, was a large, well-trained dog, its eyes gleaming strangely in the dim light. Sandra's body went rigid. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. Panic surged through her veins, roaring louder than any hunger ever had. "No, please," she whimpered, turning to Madame Becky, tears streaming down her cheeks, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "I can't. I won't." Madame Becky stepped forward calmly, placing firm hands on Sandra's shaking shoulders, forcing her to look into those merciless eyes. "The 5 million nairas is already yours," she whispered, her voice sweet yet sinister, a gentle threat wrapped in silk. "Do you want to lose it all now?" Sandra's heart was pounding so hard she could hear nothing else. The room blurred, her head spinning with dread and disbelief. Her knees buckled, but Madame Becky held her upright, pushing her gently forward. "Remember, Sandra," she hissed softly into her ear. "Obedience means survival." Sandra's legs felt numb, her mind screaming to run, to flee, to vanish. But she was trapped, not just by the walls around her, but by poverty, by desperation, by hunger. She felt her mind fracture as the door quietly shut behind Madame Becky. What happened next was unspeakable, unbearable, an act that tore through her body, her soul, her very sense of self, leaving her numb and empty. Afterward, she staggered to the bathroom, spending hours under scalding water, trying to wash away the shame, the horror, the humiliation. When Sandra emerged from the shower, The money was waiting neatly on her bed, stacks of crisp bills promising a life she no longer recognized. Her trembling fingers touched it lightly, but nausea surged violently in her stomach. Her hands shook uncontrollably. A nurse quietly entered, guiding Sandra to sit on the edge of the bed. Without a word, she pressed a needle into Sandra's arm, injecting something cold and strange into her veins. "It's just vitamins," the nurse lied softly. "They'll help you forget." Sandra wanted desperately to believe her, even as darkness filled her vision once more. Sandra had become someone she no longer recognized. Mirrors were her enemies now, reflecting a girl she once knew, hollow-eyed and unfamiliar. She quickly learned she was not alone. The mansion was a sprawling prison filled with silent girls, each locked within their own invisible cage. They were like ghosts wandering the luxurious hallways, their eyes carefully avoiding any meaningful glance, afraid that if they truly saw each other's pain, it might become unbearable. Each girl was from somewhere else. Ama from Ghana, silent as stone; Rosine from Benin, who sobbed quietly at night; Ifeoma from Imo State, always rocking herself in the corner of the common room. They were sisters in suffering, connected by shared secrets and sealed lips. But no one ever spoke openly about what went on behind the ornate, heavy doors. Words were dangerous, capable of breaking the fragile balance they held onto with trembling fingers. Every time Sandra completed another session, her bank balance soared into amounts she had only ever seen scribbled onto paper by others. Fantasy money she once believed could heal any wound. But this money felt dirty, tainted with secrets, pain, and unspoken shame. Even though the numbers rose dramatically, 5 million became 10, then 20. It seemed the money vanished as quickly as it arrived, spent recklessly, as if she hoped to buy back a piece of herself. Each session was meticulously recorded. Madame Becky had been clear from the start. "This is our insurance policy," she explained calmly, tapping a manicured finger against a tablet screen displaying Sandra's tortured face. "If you ever decide to run, these videos will be your shadow. Everywhere you go, they'll follow." The threat was enough to drown any thought of escape. The day of her second major job, Sandra was dressed in delicate silks and perfumed oils, but beneath her beautiful attire, her skin crawled. Madame Becky inspected her carefully, adjusting her collar of shimmering gold with quiet authority. "You'll behave today, Sandra," she whispered close, almost motherly. "They're important ritual clients. Their wealth comes from obedience, from your silence. Do not embarrass me." Sandra's pulse quickened as she was led to the special room. The walls were draped with deep red cloth, embroidered with strange symbols, candles flickering from golden holders placed carefully around the room. At the center waited another animal, large, powerful, trained, and nearby stood 3 men in ritual robes, their faces hidden behind masks carved with frightening precision. Her body began trembling uncontrollably, heart hammering wildly inside her chest, her breath short and panicked. She turned instinctively, seeking Madame Becky's eyes for mercy, but found only an icy stare, warning her without words to comply or face consequences, far worse than humiliation. The men stood still, statuesque and expectant, their hidden eyes boring into her. She felt her knees buckle, reality slipping like sand between her fingers. "Please, Madame Becky." "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking with desperation. "Don't make me." But Madame Becky leaned close, her breath warm, but her words chilling. "You can. You will. 20 million naira, Sandra. You've already said yes by standing here. Don't lose it all now." Sandra knew Becky was right. She'd stepped too far into this nightmare, and turning back meant facing a life even darker than before. With the weight of hopelessness pressing down, she closed her eyes, surrendering to the unspeakable. When the ritual began, the room seemed to spin and blur, images fragmenting into sharp shards of pain and degradation. Her mind retreated deep within itself, creating walls of numbness against the horror. When it finally ended, she lay motionless on the cold marble floor, the men in robes silently departing, their footsteps fading into distant echoes. Back in her lavish bedroom, Sandra stared blankly at the ceiling, her body clean again, but her spirit stained forever. Her hands trembled as she gripped the thick bundles of cash placed neatly beside her bed. She was richer than she'd ever imagined, but her mind had begun unraveling, threads fraying at the edges, sanity slipping steadily away. Days blurred together after that. Endless rituals, mounting money, and fading memories. Her thoughts turned cloudy, nightmares chasing her into waking moments, shadows whispering secrets she couldn't quite grasp. Each obedient act chipped away another piece of her soul, leaving her hollow, barely more than a puppet of flesh and blood, bound by invisible chains. Sandra no longer remembered her mother's face clearly, or her life before the mansion. She no longer remembered the dreams she'd once had, or who she had hoped to become. All that remained was the cold, gleaming collar of gold around her neck, a constant, cruel reminder that she belonged not to herself, but to them. Sandra's mind was beginning to betray her. The days and nights blurred together, a haze of confusion and dread punctuated only by moments of pain she desperately wished she could forget. Each morning was a mystery, each awakening a cruel surprise. But today was different. Sandra woke slowly, the sunlight bleeding through her closed eyelids like knives. As consciousness crept back, she felt a sharp, burning pain in her thigh. Slowly, fearfully, she peeled back the silk sheets. Her eyes widened, her breath caught sharply in her throat. There, etched deep into her flesh, were ritual marks, dark and precise, symbols she couldn't read or understand. She traced them with trembling fingers, feeling the raised edges and dried blood. Panic rose like bile, twisting painfully in her stomach. She had no memory of how they got there. Her mind raced, trying desperately to recall anything from the night before, but it was blank, a void she couldn't penetrate. She knew immediately what had caused it, those so-called vitamins. The injections they gave her daily, promising strength, clarity, peace. Lies wrapped in soothing tones, deceit disguised as care. Sandra realized now they were stealing moments from her, erasing memories, leaving only echoes of fear. These blackouts terrified her even more than what she could remember clearly. That afternoon, as she sat staring blankly into space, screams echoed down the hallway. Girls ran past her room, whispering in hushed terror. Sandra followed, driven by curiosity and dread. At the end of the corridor, Loveth, a fragile, quiet girl from Delta, hung limply from a ceiling fan, swaying gently. But her attempt had failed. The rope had snapped, leaving her gasping on the floor. Madame Becky stood over her calmly, eyes cold as ice. Sandra's blood froze as Madame Becky spoke, her voice steady but deadly. Loveth broke her blood oath, she explained to the gathered girls, almost conversationally. She spoke when silence was sworn. Sandra watched in horror as two guards dragged Loveth away. When she returned days later, Loveth was silent, her mouth open to speak, but no words emerged. Only then did Sandra notice the bandages around Loveth's jaw, the vacant, haunted look in her eyes. Loveth's tongue had been cut out, a gruesome reminder that silence was law. Fear settled deep within Sandra's bones, gnawing relentlessly at her sanity. She retreated to her room, sinking onto the edge of her bed. Moments later, Madame Becky appeared, her presence always sudden and unsettling. Her voice was almost sweet as she said, "Sandra, we're preparing you for something special. A client from Europe is coming. 100 million naira awaits. Your biggest obedience yet." Sandra's mind screamed in silent protest. Desperate, she tried feigning illness, trembling violently, clutching her stomach in agony. Madame Becky only laughed softly, unimpressed. Moments later, a spiritualist arrived, an imposing man draped in beads and cloth, his eyes dark with power. He chanted softly, pressing sharp-smelling herbs against Sandra's skin until resistance fled from her limbs, leaving her helplessly obedient once again. That night was brutal, relentless, a nightmare from which she could not awaken. Sandra bled heavily, collapsing afterward, barely conscious. As darkness swallowed her vision, she felt gentle hands wiping away blood, heard quiet whispers of comfort. When her eyes fluttered open briefly, a young maid hovered above her, tears glistening in wide eyes, quietly tending to Sandra's wounds, stitching her broken body back together with gentle, careful fingers. After that night, Sandra stopped looking in mirrors. She avoided her reflection, terrified of meeting eyes that no longer felt like her own. She was afraid of seeing the marks, the scars, terrified of recognizing what she had become. Her body was no longer hers, but an instrument, a vessel for their twisted rituals. The person in the mirror wasn't Sandra anymore. She was someone else entirely, a shadow trapped in a life she could neither escape nor endure. Sandra had waited for this moment for months, carefully planning every detail with a patience born out of desperation. Every night, after the house went silent, she'd quietly gather the bills Madame Becky gave her after each obedience. Each bundle of naira represented pain, humiliation, and sacrifice, money earned through suffering she couldn't even whisper to herself. The amount grew steadily until it reached 10 million nairas, a sum she'd only imagined in dreams long ago. She wrapped it carefully in plastic bags, burying it inside an empty soapbox hidden under layers of clothes in her wardrobe, knowing that someday this money would buy her freedom. One night, opportunity knocked in the form of a sudden blackout. Darkness descended swiftly on the mansion, plunging its heavily guarded halls into temporary chaos. The silence that followed seemed deafening. Sandra knew she had only minutes to act. Her heart pounded so violently she feared the noise alone would betray her. With trembling hands, she retrieved the soapbox, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline. From the shadows, the young maid appeared, eyes wide with fear, but filled with determination. Sandra had come to trust her quietly, a gentle figure who had silently helped heal her broken body after brutal sessions. Without speaking, the maid nodded, leading Sandra swiftly through the dark corridors, navigating carefully around sharp corners, past sleeping guards, down a hidden stairwell, and finally to a small door that opened directly onto the mansion's garden. Sandra felt the cool night air on her face like a kiss from freedom itself. She hesitated for only a heartbeat, then slipped into the night, running with everything she had left. Days later, Sandra found herself far away from Lagos, hidden within a remote village deep in the countryside, far removed from anyone who might recognize her face. Here, beneath a quiet sky, she rented a small hut and tried desperately to disappear. The villagers were friendly but distant, wrapped up in their own struggles, uninterested in asking too many questions. At first, Sandra barely slept, constantly checking windows and doors, always expecting danger. But slowly, cautiously, her body began to relax. She allowed herself to believe, just briefly, that maybe she had truly escaped, that perhaps freedom was finally hers. Then the package came. It was early morning when the village boy knocked gently at her door, handing her the neatly wrapped box without a word. Sandra's pulse quickened immediately, dread pooling in her stomach as she carried the package inside. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she tore away the layers of wrapping paper, breath catching painfully when she saw the contents. Inside was a photograph, an innocent face smiling brightly, her young cousin. Beneath the photograph, coiled menacingly like a serpent, was a collar engraved with Sandra's own name in cold, unfeeling gold. Her vision blurred with sudden tears as she turned the photo over. Scribbled on the back was a message in bold letters. "You were never free. You belong to us." Sandra dropped the photo as though it had burned her fingers, stumbling backward until she hit the wall, her breathing ragged, heart pounding. Panic flooded her veins. They had found her. They knew exactly where she was. Worse still, they knew her family. Her cousin's innocent smile mocked her now, a bitter reminder of the price she paid for daring to believe in escape. That night, Sandra sat in a corner of her hut, curled tightly with knees pressed against her chest, the photo clutched in her trembling hand. She barely heard the quiet rustling outside her door, shadows shifting silently under moonlight. Suddenly, the door crashed open violently, wood splintering with a loud crack. Masked men burst inside, moving swiftly like predators. Sandra's screams echoed uselessly into the night as rough hands grabbed her, dragging her across the cold dirt floor and tossing her into a waiting vehicle outside. The journey back was a blur of sobs, dread, and helplessness. Sandra's mind spun, desperately searching for escape, but finding none. When she was finally thrown before Madame Becky once more, the older woman stared down at her coldly, eyes glittering with cruel satisfaction. "Now," Becky said softly, voice dripping with menace, "you serve without payment. You belong fully to us." Sandra's heart shattered again as she watched guards pour gasoline onto her hard-earned 10 million nairas, tossing a lit match carelessly. The money burst into flames, her hope turning instantly to ash. She stared numbly at the smoke, rising slowly into the darkened sky, feeling the invisible chains tighten once again around her throat. Her body was theirs, her money burned, her freedom an illusion, gone forever. Sandra hadn't spoken a word in days. Silence had become her shield, a fragile wall between her and the twisted world around her. The other girls no longer met her gaze. They whispered about her when they thought she couldn't hear, their voices thin, afraid, and edged with something bitter. Maybe envy, maybe relief. To them, Sandra was now chosen, marked for something beyond mere obedience. They knew what it meant, even if Sandra herself struggled to comprehend it fully. Madame Becky moved through the mansion with an air of sinister purpose, her smiles sharper, her presence heavier. She took Sandra aside one afternoon, placing delicate red beads around her neck, adjusting them as though Sandra were a prized doll. "The vessel," Madame Becky whispered, her voice low and reverent. Sandra shivered involuntarily at the name, the implication filling her with dread. The beads felt heavier than they looked, like chains pulling her down into an abyss from which she might never escape. In her solitude, Sandra's mind began racing, desperate to find an outlet for the thoughts that threatened to consume her. She stole a small notebook, hiding it beneath her mattress, and began writing, each word a secret confession wrapped in layers of codes and symbols. She wrote about her pain, about the mansion's dark rituals, about girls who vanished into thin air. She wrote about names, faces, and every truth she'd been forced to swallow. Finally, with trembling fingers, she lifted a loose floorboard near her bed, carefully placing the notebook beneath it. She had thought herself unseen, but as Sandra pressed the wood back into place, she noticed movement in her doorway. A cleaner girl, barely 14, wide-eyed with fear and curiosity. Their eyes locked for a moment, and Sandra's heart nearly stopped. Without speaking, she pleaded silently with her gaze, her lips forming the desperate word, "Please." The cleaner girl's eyes flickered with understanding, Or perhaps pity, as she nodded slightly and slipped away, disappearing into the shadows. Night came faster than Sandra wanted. It was a night filled with tension, electricity crackling in the air, signaling the beginning of something monstrous. Madame Becky and her attendants bathed Sandra meticulously, anointing her body in fragrant oils, dressing her in a flowing gown of deep crimson silk. They led her slowly down corridors she had never seen before, lined with flickering candles that threw grotesque shadows against the walls. Each step felt heavier, each heartbeat louder. At last, they reached a large ornate door, carved with symbols that matched the ones on Sandra's thigh. As it opened, a strange chant spilled forth, a chorus of men's voices, resonating deeply and mingled with unsettling animal cries. The room was expansive, dimly lit, walls lined with masked figures dressed in robes, their faces hidden in shadow. Animals paced restlessly inside golden cages, their eyes glinting strangely. Sandra's breathing quickened. Panic surged violently through her veins. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body betrayed her, heavy, sluggish, drugged. Her mind began spinning, drifting in and out of clarity, reality and nightmare blending together as hands guided her gently but firmly to the center of the room. She was placed on a cold platform, her wrists gently bound with silken rope, heart pounding wildly as the chanting intensified around her. Through blurred vision, she saw masked figures stepping closer, circling her, their voices rising in fervor, building towards something Sandra knew instinctively would destroy her forever. A figure stepped forward, holding something sharp, gleaming in candlelight. Sandra's breath froze. The room seemed to close in on her, shadows reaching hungrily. Then, suddenly, a gunshot cracked violently through the mansion, echoing from the hallway outside. Everything froze in an instant. Someone screamed, a sound filled with confusion and terror, and the lights exploded into sudden, complete darkness. Sandra felt herself slipping into unconsciousness, the drugs overtaking her. The world vanished into blackness. When she finally came to, her senses returned slowly. The first sensation was warmth, sticky, wet warmth beneath her. She opened her eyes, blinking rapidly, trying to understand where she was, what had happened. Sandra's heart slammed against her ribs as she realized she lay in a pool of blood. She sat up, panicked, her hands frantically checking her body for wounds. There were none. Her skin was unbroken, her clothes were soaked, but it wasn't her blood. Horror surged through her veins. The room was empty, candles extinguished, cages abandoned, robes discarded. The red beads around her neck were shattered, scattered across the floor like forgotten dreams. The ornate door stood slightly ajar, beckoning to her like a silent plea. Her body trembled uncontrollably as she staggered upright, slipping slightly in the blood. Something vibrated nearby. A phone lay discarded, screen illuminated. Sandra grabbed it with shaking hands, nearly dropping it in her haste. She read the glowing message, her heart stopping briefly. "Run! They're coming back!" Sandra's breath caught in her throat. The silence pressed down heavily on her shoulders. In that instant, she understood the price of silence, the bitter cost of obedience. Every second counted now. She stared into the darkness outside the open door, paralyzed for just a heartbeat longer. Then, gathering what little strength she had left, she began to move, running blindly into the unknown, desperate to escape before the shadows returned for her again. To be continued. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when part 2 drops. You won't want to miss what happens next.